Well, Brittni, thank you so much for joining me here today. And, we connected over Twitter, over some fire tweets that you had sent a couple of weeks back that really intrigued me. We're going to get into kind of our high level team building philosophy here in a couple of moments. But I want to start first with your experience as a high level athlete. And, you've spent time in the NBA, but before that, you were a high level high school player and college basketball player. So just take us back to your college basketball days and tell us a little bit about your career and kind of how that set you up for your eventual transition into the NBA.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. Glad we could connect on Twitter. I'm excited for this conversation. I grew up, playing all the sports. I was a little athlete growing up. Both my parents were athletes, so I guess I was sort of born into it. But really fell in love with basketball at a young age, and had aspirations to play collegiately, professionally at a very young age. I actually thought I'd play in the NBA because that's all I watched on TV. So it's kind of funny that I ended up there, but so I played, in high school. We had a pretty good team, pretty successful. We won the state championship, and I was fortunate enough to be coached by, one of the most renowned coaches in the state. So felt like I had a really good, I was set up for the college experience, which I know a lot of athletes aren't. So I felt very fortunate about that, and went on to play Division I basketball at the University of Northern Iowa. Which is a mid-major school in Iowa, often like a little sister school, but we are so competitive, man. Like in every sport, we compete with the big schools, and it was a great experience. Unfortunately, I underwent 4 knee operations when I was there, so I somehow played every year, at least in a few games, even though I was sidelined quite often. But I think, I had aspirations to play professionally, and the injuries sort of put a damper on that dream. But, I would never wish injury upon anybody, but I had a unique experience while I was injured. I was able to sort of start seeing the game through different lenses. I'd have conversations with our coaching staff, about scouting and all these things, because I had this extra time on my hands and couldn't actually be on the court. So I think that sort of piqued my interest into getting into coaching someday, or, being a part of a team or an organization past my playing career. I was studying math for no real reason at the time. I had studying statistics. I was getting a degree in statistics and actuarial sciences. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. It was just something I chose because math was always natural to me and easy to me. And I enjoyed doing different types of analysis, and I would always gravitate towards sports analysis. So after I decided, I'm done playing, I can't play anymore, I've had all these surgeries. What can I do with this degree that can keep me in sports? And came across, this sports analytics movement that was happening at the time. It was shortly after, the Moneyball era and all of that. So a lot of professional sports organizations, all sports, were looking for analysts to come join their team and do data analysis for, their teams. And that's sort of where I started. I started applying to jobs everywhere. It didn't matter the sport. It didn't matter the organization. It could have been a media outlet. I didn't really care. But that's how I got my foot in the door in the sports analytics world at Stats, a company called Stats in Chicago. And from there, I worked my way into the NBA.
Very cool. A very unique path also. Most people aren't just doing math and then decide to steer that towards sports. Although, like you mentioned, in the last 4 or 5 years, definitely a greater focus. And we'll get into that in a moment. First, I'm curious, do you have to have like a specialization when it comes to data or analytics? Or when you go into an organization or a company like Stats, do they just kind of like dump numbers on you and then ask you to kind of like create a graph out of it? Just kind of like give us a little bit of insight into how that world works.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit more sophisticated now, where there's a wide spectrum of different types of jobs in sports analytics. I was more of an analyst, so I would take the data and analyze it and help decision makers make decisions with it. but there's so many other jobs like back end engineers. There's data, people who clean the data, people who store the data and organize the data. And then there's, more statistical driven people who are doing, really complex like modeling with the data. There's data scientists. So like now there's a whole spectrum of things you can do in the data analysis world in sports. And when I first entered, that was not the case. So I think I kind of lucked out because, they would pretty much, anybody that had any sports experience and technical experience, it was really rare. And I think it's still pretty rare to have high level experience in both of those things. But, I wouldn't say there's like one thing you need to have. I think there's a wide, range of things you could do. It just depends what you want to do. And for me, that was more of like the front end analysis side of things. And I had the qualifications to do that. So, my job didn't require a lot of like coding. I did code a little bit, but, that wasn't the bulk of my job. But that, is a job that people do in sports analytics. So it really depends what you want to do.
Yeah, I know in my experience in coaching, especially towards the end of my time, where I had obviously had over a decade of experience breaking down film, being a coach on the field. But then I also had this kind of dual role of breaking down the film and like trying to translate what I was seeing into like very easily digestible pieces for coaches. And had I gone back, if I could go back to tell myself like leaving coaching in 2015, 16, I would be like, Evan, you need to like focus on this, because I felt that in no way was I at your stats expertise level. But from a coach's perspective, I could see the game in those spreadsheets and then translate that into a colorful graph, right? And like, I think that it's like you mentioned, there's very few people that have the experience within the sports world and the data world. And there's kind of like this idea that it's either like the data people, the quote unquote nerds, and then it's the gruff coaches with the whistle around their neck. Obviously, that's a very like antiquated and probably inaccurate way of viewing things, but I think that's the common perception. And it sounds like you were able to kind of like straddle both of those lines, which of course, led to your next experience with the Raptors.
Yeah, you're so right. There is even still a misconception around, like you said, it's not a dichotomy. It's not, there's data people and sports people and the two do not overlap. That's not true. I'm a living example of that. And I was sort of, a conduit between the two, a translator of sorts. And I think that role is more and more in demand now across sports as teams are hiring more people to be on the data side of the operation. They want that information to be translated in a way that decision makers understand and can digest and can use. And you need people who can speak both languages in order for that to happen.
Yes, exactly. And like the thing that I saw in my experience is the people that I knew that were dealing with data, it's almost like they want to share all of the data with coaches. And like from my coach's point of view, I was like, yeah, the coaches don't care about any of that. They care about these 3 stats, or they care about these 3 areas. And I think there is a tremendous amount of value in being able to say like, okay, yes, we want to look at all of the data, but we also need to pick out those crucial elements and be able to present them to the people that maybe don't have the ability to, as you said, translate all of those things.
Yeah, it's really more about asking the right questions and having all of the answers. That's really what it comes down to is making sure that, we have all this information. Is it useful? Is it just noise? What do we really want to get to? And how do we get to it in the most concise way possible? And you mentioned something really important about, making it aesthetically and visually appealing to coaches, because I think that's something that we almost undervalue in the data world is the presentation of the data itself. If you take the same information from a spreadsheet and put it into a pretty graph, coaches are going to digest it way quicker and they'll be way more open to getting more information in that way. So now teams are even hiring people just to design the reports, that get to coaches. So it's so important. And you're spot on, but yeah, it's a lot of information, and coaches already get, at least the professional level, they're already getting so much information from so many different sources. So the more concise we can be, the better.
Yeah, 100%. You said ask the right questions. Who needs to ask the right questions? Is it you as the person looking at the data? Is it the decision makers? What did you mean by that?
I think it's both. I think the two need to work together. Like I mentioned, the people that have access to all the data and can speak, quote unquote, speak data, and the people who are actually making the decisions need to work together and ask the right questions together. Because I think the two can really inform each other's decision making. The coaches and the people with high level sports expertise who have been doing it for how many years and seen however many reps, they have a lot of insight into player development, into strategy, et cetera, that you don't have unless you've gotten all of those reps, right? So they can help the data people or the people who are putting together these models for decision making, maybe capture things that they're not thinking of or that they wouldn't have considered, and add that to the model to make the model better. And then vice versa, like a lot of people in the coaching world, we have biases, we're human, we're under high amounts of pressure a lot, we have to make quick decisions, and having some sort of objective backing to our decision making really, really helps. So the two can really, really help each other. Again, it's not a dichotomy. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. We need to find a way to enhance each other's abilities ultimately. And I think, like you mentioned, that sort of translator conduit role is really crucial in doing that.
Yeah, and I think I was in coaching in like a very interesting time because Moneyball had just been published at like the very beginning of my coaching career around 2005, 2006-ish. So it was even still a new concept, even though the A's were having success. And I think like what I've seen, and I just believe this to be true, is that like the diversity of thought within a coaching staff is vitally important to not only like just seeing what else might be out there, but also like expanding the bounds of your capacity. Like I think there's this notion of like, well, like when Bear Bryant coached me in 1955, we ran 4 plays. And it's like, okay, like that's great. That's a great story. But like this is a different time and we have all these different things and like obviously we're talking about data available to us. Like it's not a bad thing to even like just start incorporating it and considering these things. Did you find like in your career that you faced a lot of resistance personally, or is this just kind of like on the whole for analytics in sports right now?
Yeah, I think there is still a level of resistance to this line of thinking. And it's the reason why is a mixture of things. I think the media honestly has something to do with it, sort of presenting analytics in a way that's really not true at all. Like only shoot threes in basketball is like the typical like media analytics perception of like, this is what analytics is. And that's just not true. So I think sort of these false stories have been perpetuated about like what analytics is used for and what it's meant to help with. And it's put people in those positions in a tough position because we're constantly having to try and prove why we're useful, when really it's I think it comes down to just like people better understanding their own biases, people better understanding like the cognitive science behind why we make decisions and why we maybe are short-sighted in some of our decisions, and having knowledge around that so that we understand like, oh, this is what the data is supposed to be used for. Oh, this is how it can help me. Like it's not supposed to be me against the data. It's actually supposed to be a tool that I can use to enhance, my knowledge and my expertise that I already have. So I think it's just like a narrative shift that needs to happen. There definitely are coaches and decision makers that are very open to this and very willing to learn more about it. But there is an inherent risk in doing things differently and doing things, in taking new information and actually trying to use it. Especially when you're working in a professional organization, the idea of like tinkering with something is very scary, because if it doesn't work, then you might lose your job, so it's like, it's going to take some time. It's gotten better over time, I think, but we're still definitely in the trenches of like shifting the narrative around how and why data can be used in an organization.
Interesting. And you mentioned you were at Stats, and I think after this you ended up at the Raptors. And I might be wrong, but just kind of tell us how you went from working with Stats to eventually landing with an NBA team.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate at Stats. My job there was working with their SportView product, which now I believe it's Second Spectrum, who has the contract with the NBA, but the player tracking cameras and the player tracking data that the NBA teams use. At the time, they were using SportView and our data at Stats. And at the time, not every NBA team had a team of analysts or a team of data people internally. So the Raptors were one of the more sophisticated teams where they had an infrastructure, they had all the data set up, very early. They were one of the first teams to sort of dive deep into that and use all of that. So they were pretty set, but there was a lot of other teams that didn't have that resource. And so I would sort of be the third party consultant, where they would come to me and ask me to make, custom reports using our data based on whatever they wanted. So I had a lot of connections in the NBA through that job. They were my clients. A lot of teams were my clients. And so after working there for 2 years, I made enough connections and ended up going to NBA Summer League one summer. And, I kind of decided, I think I want to work for a team. I think I could do this for a team. And the Raptors happened to have an open spot, and I was fortunate enough to meet the right people and get an interview. And that's where it started.
Very cool. Obviously you are the sum of your experiences, but I can totally identify with kind of having that draw to maybe, hey, I could do this at a higher level, or maybe like embed at a higher level. And you had a unique experience, because you got to like be in different departments and in different roles within the Raptors. So just kind of talk about getting there, and then maybe just kind of like your evolution during your time there.
Yeah, I had a very unique experience, like you mentioned. I got to look through different lenses in a very short period of time in an organization. Not very short. I was there for 4 years, but my first 2 years were in the front office on the analytics team. And as I mentioned, I was primarily working as a data analyst. So taking the data that we had and putting it into meaningful reports that decision makers could use, and those decision makers being both the GM and the president of the organization and the coaching staff. So, I would assist with the draft and free agency and all of that, but then I would also spend a lot of time preparing scouting reports for coaching staff, or player development reports, or self-assessment reports. And I started noticing pretty early on, like, I really loved the work I was able to do for the coaching staff, and those conversations around, how I could help them from a data perspective, and strategy conversations and player development conversations. And I started gravitating towards those conversations, more than like, how much money should we give this guy? Where does he fit on our roster? Like the salary cap conversations. So that was a signal to myself, like, okay, maybe I'm, more interested in the coaching side of the operation. Where do I fit there? I'm not sure, but I'm enjoying it. But I also was able to do some scouting when I was in the front office. And so player evaluation was something I was able to do, not just from a data perspective, but actually going and scouting and watching players and gathering intel and all of those things. So I got that unique experience as well. And then, we won the championship in 2019, which was an unreal experience. And then many of our coaches went on to get promoted to other jobs, or take on other roles after that year. And there were some openings on our coaching staff. And I had the opportunity to move over to the coaching staff full time and sit on the bench as an assistant coach. And so once again, had, a different view into the organization and different meetings and conversations. And so, I was able to, like see many different perspectives of how the whole operation works, and maybe, where maybe some gaps are, or like maybe where some holes need to be filled, or where some information is lost. I was able to sort of see every side of it and sort of understand, like, how can we make this, more of an efficient workflow, or how can we get information from one side to the other more effectively, or what's missing or what's not. It was just a really unique, holistic perspective that I had that I'm not sure, many people get the opportunity to have.
No, not a lot of people get to have that opportunity. And you had this I keep using the word unique, but I think it's an adequate way to kind of describe a lot of these things that we're talking about. Two things that is very interesting about your move into the coaching role, because not only were you coaching across genders, but you were also at the time the youngest assistant coach in the NBA. So it's like either one of these would be kind of something that me personally, I would have in the back of my mind, or I would think you would have in the back of your mind. But to have both of those occurring at the same time, talk about maybe your mindset going into that coaching role. Was it something that you were aware of and like it elevated your preparation and performance? Or did you not look at it like that at all, and it wasn't going to change your approach one bit?
Yeah. Yeah, to be truthful, like, I think every woman working in a male prevalent space is 100% aware, of that at all times. And yeah, we do intentionally, we have to prepare more. We have to, we can't, we have to minimize any sort of errors we might have. And that's just unfortunately the way it is. And we're trying to shift that narrative a bit because it's a bit unfair, but yeah, I was totally aware of that. I don't think, I was so used to working predominantly with men that it didn't phase me in a way. I was so used to it. I was working in a technical field before that, where I was one of the only females in an organization of 500 plus people. So this was no different, and it didn't affect, I didn't think it affected my performance in any way or anything like that. But being the youngest was something I wasn't completely like used to. That was something that was new for me. And I think that, as I started getting the hang of it, like from the players' perspective, like they treated me as a coach. They were amazing. They saw me, like game recognizes game, like, basketball, we know basketball, we can have conversations. It's like, it wasn't an issue. But I did see like a little bit of pushback around my age, because I think there's this perception that, like, in order to have work, experience or expertise in this field, you have to put in the time, quote unquote. You have to be there 10 years and whatever. And I think I just realized, I told myself, like, that's not necessarily the truth, because I'm coming at this from a completely different angle than anybody else ever has. I have such, like you said, a unique experience that got me here, that I can't compare my journey to the person next to me's journey. It's such a different journey, and I can bring, I'm an asset in a completely different way. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Like you said, having a diverse coaching staff with different experiences and backgrounds and ways they analyze the game and ways they see the game is only going to be a good thing. So I sort of, I didn't let the fears really get to me about, well, am I going to be taken seriously because I'm 26 and, I don't have the same experience level as all these other coaches. I didn't let that get to me, because I had a very different experience and approach, and I was confident in who I was and the work I'd put in.
Yeah. And like, I mean, it's not the same, but I felt being somewhat of an outsider in football, not having played high level college or pro, and not having a dad that was involved in coaching or being a team executive. Like, I felt that as well. Like, it's like, I have to prepare because people are going to be looking to point to me as like, oh yeah, he doesn't fit. And so I recognize that same feeling of, oh, somebody else could screw it up, and then just be like, oh, well, they'll learn, where I never felt like anybody was willing to give me that benefit of the doubt. So I can recognize that. And the preparation is a big thing. But I think you hit on something, and I was actually thinking about this as you were kind of explaining it a moment ago about the diversity of thought, but also just your own experiences to get to that point. And this is one of the things, or one of the problems I have with coaching, is like there's a tremendous amount of ego associated with I went through hell to get here, and Coach Smith treated me like absolute crap. So I have to treat Brittni and Evan like absolute crap so they understand what it means to be a coach. And I hate that. And I think that that still is prevalent. And I think that people that come from different backgrounds, and specifically like with the now with females being associated more in football and in basketball, I think it's nothing but a positive thing, because having 20 people sitting around a table that all have the same path and experience to get to that seat is actually not beneficial. We all love Italian food, but like we're not going to eat Italian food every single night. Like we're going to get sick of it. And it's beneficial to have people that have different paths and different points of view, and maybe even different philosophies on what it takes to win, sit in those seats.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, if I were forming my own staff, there's definitely some sort of alignment at the fundamental core of like who a person is and what they believe in that I would want. But as you mentioned, like, what's your philosophy on breaking the zone press? Like, I hope we all have different opinions, because I want to have a creative, conversation around what we can do and strategy wise and whatnot. And also, and that doesn't apply to just X's and O's, of course, but that's just an example I'm giving. I don't want to have people underneath me that just want to agree with me in fear that like, I'm not going to like them if they disagree with me or anything like that. I just think so much more progress can be made, and so much creativity can emerge from having a culture that's it's safe and supported to offer your opinion, even if it's different than the head coach or the decision maker. I just, that's the sort of culture I would want to create and have. And I think a lot of coaches have done that and have had great success with it. So.
Yeah. And I think like you brought up another point earlier where you were saying about like the questions you were bringing to your lens that you brought to that role. And I think like this is often overlooked too, where it's this somewhat antiquated theory of thinking where, oh, well, the way that we played basketball in the 90s is you have to have a post-up player that you can go to, in the crucial moments of the game. And like, it takes a little bit of outside thinking to like just rethink or reframe what does it actually take to win. And like this is actually aligned with the tweet that you sent that made me want to reach out to you. And you talked about like the ignored factors when evaluating NBA talent and like what is truly valuable. And I think I had mentioned to you, I just recently wrote a book called Finding Intangibles, which is all about what it really takes to win and succeed at these high levels, which yes, you need talent, but just because you're athletic or 7 feet tall or can run fast doesn't mean that you're going to have success. Like time and time again, the people that have the most success are the most dedicated, the most passionate, the people that put the team first. And this is exactly kind of what I equate to what you're saying. Like you, just because you didn't have 10 years or 20 years of experience to get into that coach's role doesn't disqualify you from still being able to add value to the overall team effort and what it takes to actually win. So let me just ask you, like, the factors that are ignored in your experience, like what have you seen just from either players that you've worked with or the teams that you've been on? Obviously, you've been part of a championship team. What are the things that we don't see that actually have a huge influence and impact on success at those high levels?
Yeah, fortunately, I think we are to a point now where like we're recognizing that these things do matter. These intangibles, these things that are difficult to measure, or maybe we can't measure. I know that a lot of professional teams, NBA teams, have people dedicated on their staffs just to gathering intel on players. Like, what's their background? What's their family life? What do their coaches say about them? What do their teammates say about them? There's somebody getting paid to do that, just to gather that information. So I think we are realizing, we are to the point now where it's like, this matters, but we're not quite to the point where we're understanding how much it matters. And like, how much do we weight this in a decision about whether or not we acquire this player? Because I think we still default to like, but his stats, you know, but his wingspan, you know. So I think now the problem is like, how do we solve the problem of taking the information we do have and making it make sense and making it digestible and almost quantifiable so that we can actually use it in our decision-making models. So yeah, I think one of those things that I see time and time again is like in basketball, we call it like basketball IQ or feel, or the way a player understands the game and sees the game. That is hard to measure, quote unquote, but I do think we can do it. We just maybe don't put enough energy or resources into trying to do it because, you know, there's a lot of theories out there. There's theories that players either have it or they don't. And I think this is the case for a lot of these intangible skills. Like, they're either competitor or they're not, or they're either, you know, a hard worker or they're not, or they either are a high IQ player or they're not. And like, I don't know if I agree with that. I think a lot of these things can be taught, and the culture you create can bring those out of players. So, you know, at the end of the day, there's like a whole list of these things, but IQ is one of them that really stands out to me. I think it always tends to take a back seat to the physical attributes for some reason. And I think of like defense as a prime example. And defense in basketball is such, you know, it's such a coordinated effort in like your lateral foot speed or your wingspan. Like, it does matter, but only if you're able to make the right decision and see the read and get there to use your physical attributes. You know, only if you're able to be in the right position are you able to actually use your physical attributes. So that's just one example. How do we do a better job of understanding, does this player see the game and read the game at a high rate? You know, competitiveness is one that's obviously important, but how do we define that? What does it mean to be competitive? How do we break that down into different categories? And this is another thing, like when we're evaluating players, you know, we look at, say, playmaking, and we divide it into like 10 different things, like pick and roll playmaking in transition, playmaking here. But when we talk about like these intangibles, we just lump it all into one thing, like competitiveness. What is his rating? You know, and it's like, we need to break that down a bit and parse it down and really analyze that more, because it's not just one big umbrella thing. There's a lot of different things here that we need to be talking about. So to answer your question, like there's a lot. I don't know where to even start. I'd love to hear your point of view and what pops into your mind and the conversations you've been in and what's overlooked the most from your point of view.
Yeah. So with my book, kind of like the genesis of it was sitting in those rooms and listening to coaches talk about players and just discounting players because he's 6'1" and 5'8", but if he was 6'3", oh my gosh, like we'd for sure offer him. Or yeah, we love him, but his shoulders are kind of narrow. And like these like really like abstract, weird ways of discounting players and totally disregarding like spending 2 days with not only the player, but the family, and them being awesome. And just like a lot of things that I felt were important that I didn't know, like if they were important, because I was young. I was 23, 24 years old, sitting in these rooms. I'm not about to raise my hand. But I felt like, oh, we should be talking about this person's work ethic. We should be talking about this person's family. We should be talking about all these other things and not discussing whether like 6'1" and 5'8" is adequate to play this one position. And what I wanted to do as I went through my career, I started to find coaches that felt the same way, that were actually had processes for finding out these specific traits in in the players they were recruiting and in the players they were evaluating. And so as I was putting the book together, it's really about like, okay, how do you create a culture? How do you create a vision for like the team you want to be? And then how do you go out and like actually find the players that fit that team? And look, this is not a perfect science. Like there's a bit of uncertainty, of course, but this is all about reducing that uncertainty. Even if it's just a small percentage over an extended period of time creates a huge competitive advantage for your team. And to get to your question, the things that I started to see were commonalities in really three buckets. So I know you just said, oh, there's all these different areas, and I agree. Now, for my book's purposes, I wanted to simplify it as much as possible. And so I simplified it into three areas. Finding mindset, finding heart, and then finding team players. And I think that you see kind of the commonalities in all the great teams and all the great performers have strong indications in these three areas. And it's going to be different for each individual, potentially even in different sports, it could be different. But I think what you see is like mindset, which started with growth mindset, but it can also be equated to the intelligence that you said, or you were kind of alluding to, that basketball IQ, or just the ability to have success or a failure and still strive to continue to improve. Heart is probably the biggest one, because there's so many different buckets. There's competitiveness, which I kind of put under heart. There's the passion. There's like the importance that your sport or like what you do has in your life. I kind of equate this all under heart. And then for the team sports in particular, like this team first mentality. Everything that we're doing here is to ensure team success as a prerequisite for individual success. There's a very famous case in the NBA right now of a player that is seemingly acting very selfish, and he's one of the best players on the planet. And without getting too deep into specifics around that one case, it's like, yeah, he's one of the best players on the planet. Talent wise, he is like one of the most exciting, most athletic people that plays this sport. But like, what constitutes winning? The teams that are going to be there at the end of this playoff run here in 2022 are going to be the teams that play as a team, that have the ability to, yes, they have great individual players, but it's more how those players come together. So that was a really long-winded way of saying that I kind of bucket into like three different areas of what intangibles kind of separate the great teams and great performers.
Yeah. And you said something that stood out to me, like what constitutes winning. And I think surprisingly, like a lot of people have different answers to that, which is why, these sorts of things happen where we're overlooking these things that are very important to team success. And, I do think that is like the number one thing you need to define first and foremost before you start making decisions on what players to acquire and all of that. The other interesting thing you said was, I think you were talking about fit, and like based on the system that the team runs or the, pillars that they stand on, who would fit into that. That's something I noticed too, that especially working in professional sports, where often the people acquiring the talent and the people developing the talent and putting the players on the floor are very different, two different groups of people, right? So in college, it's different, right? Because the coaches are the ones acquiring the talent. But in the professional level, it's, the front office decision makers, they obviously have, expertise in the sport and all of that. I'm not saying they're not experts in the sport, but it's very different when you don't know the ins and outs and nuances of the system that your coaches are trying to run or implement. And the only way you know those is if you're there every day, right? It's like a lot of information you need to be aware of. And an example, like random example, like defensive scheme is, there's so many different ways you can play defense in basketball. And, sometimes teams want to run a very we want to be able to stop the ball one-on-one. That's our number one thing. If the ball gets behind us, we don't want to be in a scramble situation. We don't want to play a lot of help defense. So our number one thing is like keep the ball in front of you. That's one way, right? Another way is we're going to be really help heavy. We're going to have everybody at the midline, everybody helping. Don't worry if you get beat, apply as much ball pressure as you want. If you get beat, you have a ton of help, and then we're helping each other out. So those are very two different schemes that require very different skills to be successful. And depending on, and there's many more too, but depending on which one your team wants to implement, it matters when you're recruiting players, when you're evaluating talent. Like, okay, when it comes to defense, do we want quick lateral speed, and do we want length, or do we want like elite communicators and people who can improvise and scramble situations and people who know how to be in the right position at the right time? Because depending on what your scheme is, like those two things like could really, really matter. But if you don't have alignment on what matters, then you could be just, wasting time or resources. So that's another example of like how a conduit person could be very, very helpful, to communicate that information back and forth, or just make sure everybody's aligned or on the same page, because there's so many nuances when it comes to talent acquisition that I think might get overlooked.
Yeah. Yeah. And this happens in football a lot, predominantly, especially in the NFL. You have kind of two ways of playing defense. You have a 4-down lineman defense or a 3-down lineman defense. I mean, those are probably 50-50 split of the defenses that are played in the NFL. And they go hire somebody so that they can win the press conference, or that they can look good for like 2 weeks in the paper and say, oh, we got this former head coach who's going to come and run this defense. And it's like, more oftentimes than not, it's a completely different system in defense. That's fine. But you just spent 7 years building up personnel to run a 3-4 defense. And now this new guy, but like, we're going to win the press conference, but he runs a completely different defense. Well, like that requires 11 different roles than the 11 roles that you had for the previous 7 seasons. And like, the Dallas Mavericks are my favorite team. I will talk about this like for the next 4 hours if you would like, but I'll spare everybody that, just to say the Dallas Mavericks trade one of the best 15, 30 players in the league, right? Kristaps Porzingis as a player is amazing. And they make this trade, and they trade for Spencer Dinwiddie and Davis Bertans. I didn't even know who Davis Bertans is. All I know is that everybody on Washington Wizards Reddit hates him because he makes $17 million and he doesn't do anything. And then he comes to the Mavericks and like, he's a great fit. Why is that? Well, it just so happens he's the best corner 3-point shooter in the league by percentage. And guess what Luka Doncic is? Yes, he's this great player. He's one of the best players in the league, but he also creates the most corner threes in the entire league from any single player. So it's like on paper, man, they lost this trade. They just lost one of the top players in the league. And who did they really get back? But nobody looks at it as like, man, they got 2 guys that complement their system so well that it's going to elevate everybody on the team, which is exactly what happened. Dallas had the best second half of probably any team. And what you just said is so crucial. And yet, like, what I saw in my career is never happening, which it's like everybody is siloed. The front office is siloed from the scouts, and the scouts and the player personnel is siloed from the coaches. And everybody's just trying to hold on to their job as long as they can, so they don't have to like move their family again. And the best teams, I'm thinking of like the San Antonio Spurs, the University of Alabama's, the New England Patriots. They have this way of aligning everybody in that organization, and also constantly reassessing what it means to win. The Warriors shot 97 3-pointers in their NBA Finals games. Should we maybe look at like whether we need to get some more 3-point shooters out here? Anyway, I'm getting fired up just because like this is like right up my alley. But I appreciate you asking that, and I appreciate you acknowledging how important the fit is, because I do think that is an overlooked piece. We oftentimes look at our vision and we say, well, we have it on the wall over here. Like, we're going to be a tough team. Guys, we need to win on the road. We need to develop that road mentality. Okay, I'll see you guys at the hotel at 8:00. It's like, can we break down what a road mentality is? Like, we haven't won on the road here for 3 years.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means, and I think that happens all too frequently because we're focused on what we say, but not aligning it with what we actually do.
Spot on. This is spot on. Yeah. And I think getting to a point where we can actually hold each other accountable of like, what are the things we preach and say, and how do we evaluate whether or not we're doing those things? That's, I think another layer of evaluation we can add to our processes. How are we doing as far as the culture we're setting, but actually implementing the culture that we want to set? Like, are we hitting on that or are we not? Because that's really important.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about when teams get it right. Specifically, NBA championship teams at the end of the last decade. So just take us back to that 2019 season. Obviously, you guys had added a really great player. So maybe just kind of talk about maybe the previous years, and like, did you feel like you guys were building something special, or did everything change when Kawhi Leonard was acquired? Just kind of take us back to maybe the lead up to that championship season and what you experienced during that year.
Yeah, I think Masai is one of the more patient presidents in the league, where he I would never experience him making a rash decision or a rash trade, or he always seemed to have a long-term vision in mind. And so I do think that whole trade started many years before it actually happened. That vision came to fruition as a result of patience. And I really admired him and Bobby, our GM, for doing that. And it like really made me think about, because I saw around the league sort of how decisions were made, and I'd get like, an ear into different conversations. And that seemed to be something really unique about the Raptors. So having, big picture vision and not, getting caught up in the emotions of the decisions that might come, onto your desk in any given moment, and having the poise to sort of understand the big picture at all times was something I think the Raptors were remarkable at. I mean, we acquired Kawhi, which was a huge, we had a lot of talent, and we had, there was a lot of decisions that were made that, were not easy decisions to get rid of, very talented players, a very good coach. There were a lot of things that happened and changed in a short amount of time that I can't imagine, Masai having those conversations with those people, wonderful people, but it comes down to, like we were mentioning, fit and the long-term vision of what that looks like. And sometimes hard decisions have to be made, but I think ultimately it was the right one, obviously, because we won the championship. And and with a new coach and a new system, and it was really interesting to see, and I give our coaching staff a lot of credit, and also the people who evaluated the talent who was on the team when that all happened, because they really bought into the change and the new system and everything, and the player development that happened. A lot of the really impactful players on that team developed in such a short amount of time. We had undrafted players that were like really contributing to this run, to this season. And I think it all came together. I know, like, winning a championship is a lot, it's not easy, and it does take a little bit of luck, for every team that does it. So like, I'm not saying the Raptors did everything right, but they did a lot right, and that matters. And like you said, it's all about trying to minimize as many, losses that you can. And you're never going to make every right decision, whether it's player development, strategy, scheme, player acquisition, but the more wrong decisions you can eliminate, the better.
Yes. Yeah. Well said. And Bill Walsh, the great San Francisco 49ers coach, used to always say, your goal isn't to summit. Your goal is to build a base camp near the summit so that you can hopefully, weather permitting, summit or at least have an attempt to summit. And so I kind of equate that to, like, there's injuries to other teams. There's just like the luck that you associated with like playing a long, hard NBA season, that like you just want to give yourself a chance to get into the playoffs and have a chance to make a run at a championship. And yeah, it was obviously a great run for you guys that year. And I another thing I really liked about what you said is the patience, because I think that this gets lost a lot of times. Like, we focus so much on winning, and like, if you don't win a championship, like, what's the point? And obviously, I understand that's the nature of the high performance sports and the businesses we choose, but like, there's also a certain patience that's required that you see from all of the really great teams. In other words, they're not trying to like go out and force, and oftentimes like that doesn't end up being successful, or it only results in a short-term results. And I think the teams that really have success on a sustained basis have that patience of which you talked about, which is really cool.
Yeah, and it requires, I mean, I give Masai and Bobby a lot of credit, but it also requires, an ownership team that gives them the ability to be patient and doesn't put, the tremendous amount of pressure on them to win right now. So it's a very coordinated effort, and it's a big testament to like what type of culture you build, even from an ownership standpoint. That to allow your decision makers to have patience and to see the bigger picture.
Yes. And so I had some other notes, but we're probably gonna have to get you on here another time, Brittni, because I wanted to nerd out with you on end of game situations and measuring the immeasurables. So we'll have to shelve that for part 2. But I was really interested in hearing about a new project that you're working on. So I just want to give you the opportunity to share with us a little bit about what you're doing with Strata, and just kind of tell us kind of like what made you get involved in this.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to talk about that. I'm very excited about it. So me and 2 other business partners, came together sort of last September, at the end of last summer, and it's kind of divine timing how we all came together. But essentially, we observed a similar problem in the youth sports landscape. And one of my business partners has 5 kids, and he's going through it right now with his kids playing sports, and sort of approached me and another person with this idea of like, can we change the landscape of youth sports? Because currently it's quite scary. Like in the United States, 70% of kids are dropping out of sports by the time they reach high school, and that's just that rate is getting higher by the year, and especially for young girls, it's getting higher and higher. And as we know, there's so much life and leadership development that you can gain by playing sport at a youth age. And the reasonings behind the why kids are dropping out, it's everywhere from they're too pressure, they're under an immense amount of pressure to perform. You think about like they're rating eight-year-olds now, like across the country, like this is crazy. Like, what are we doing? So, a lot of youth programs, not saying there aren't good coaches out there, because there absolutely are, but a lot of the best coaches are at the top of the pyramid where the least amount of athletes are, professional, college, whatever. And then you go down to the bottom of the pyramid where most people are playing sports, and you're not getting trained professional coaches. And so a lot of times there's misguided coaching, or coaches that are yelling at kids, and all these things that it makes the experience not a fun one for a kid. And so there's so many factors as to why kids are dropping out of sport, but ultimately we wanted to create a space where kids could come and learn and develop within their sport, but also it's a learning laboratory essentially. So we want them to come and experiment, and we want to create a culture where it's safe to make mistakes, and because that's part of the learning process. We want to make it fun. We want to teach the more intangible skills that we've been talking about. So we're incentivizing things like bringing energy and being a good teammate and responding to your mistakes in a positive way, and making eye contact with your coaches. These are the things that we're really highlighting and celebrating, instead of how many points you scored or how many assists you had in a game. So we're really trying to shift the experience from a binary, like win, lose is good, bad, for a 10-year-old kid, to just, a lifetime passion for improvement and enjoyment of playing sport. And, we have a small program running right now, and we hope to expand that in the future. But right now it's pretty experimental. We're trying to see what works, what doesn't with our curriculum. We have wonderful coaches. We're trying to see, can we start to actually like measure and evaluate these things like we've talked about? Could we start measuring, are they responding to their mistakes positively? Are they bringing energy? Are they being good leaders? How can we sort of incorporate data into this project as well? So there's a lot of up in the air things, but I think ultimately our goal is to create more of a safe space for kids to learn and play and have fun, and really what sports are supposed to be about.
Very cool. I love it. This is obviously, well, maybe not obviously. I started my career coaching youth sports and was involved in coaching and refereeing youth sports for a long period of time. And part of the reason I got into coaching initially. So I love to hear projects like this, because it's really at the true essence of what sports is about, especially at the younger levels where, yes, like we want to win. That competitive aspect is part of sports, but there's so many other things that are really vital and why sports are important. I mean, learning that type of work ethic and responding to that failure and understanding that it's okay to make mistakes is so crucial just to developing as a young man or woman, that I think it's wonderful what you guys are doing.
Well, thank you. And like ultimately we want to try and prove too that this approach to sport could lead to on-court performance as well, like as a byproduct. If you focus on these more intangible skills, if you create an environment that's safe and fun and inclusive, like you also might have on-court before, you also might get some wins, get some like on-court development too, and we think we will. And if that's the case, then why wouldn't we approach the sport in this way anywhere?
Of course. Well, Brittni, thank you so much for joining me here today. One last question to get you out of here with. You won a championship in 2019, and with that comes the celebrations and the parade. So I want either your best championship story or your best Drake story, or maybe if there's a story that intertwines both of them, just give us like your favorite memory or story from the aftermath of the 2019 championship.
Yeah, that was a very eventful month or so. I have a lot. I guess if we want a Drake specific one, I don't think I've told the story to many people. So here we go. After we won the Eastern Conference Finals at home, the staff was able to go onto the court for the trophy ceremony, and I was in the front office at the time, so we sat up like way up top in the gondola, like media gondola. So it took us a little bit to get down to the court with the rest of the staff to celebrate. And by the time we got down there, they had boxes of hats and shirts for the staff to get and wear. And by the time we got down there, they were pretty much all gone. And so I was like scouring around to find myself like an Eastern Conference champs hat. And I find like one left in a box, and Drake was like standing next to it and he had one on his head already, and he was about to go grab the last hat. And I ran over there and kind of boxed him out and grabbed the last hat and ran away. So I got my hat. So I'm very, but I don't know how he felt about that. I'm sorry, Drake, if you're listening to this. I thought you already had one, so I thought I deserved it. But ultimately, everybody ended up getting a hat. It was no worries, but I was very concerned that I was going to miss out on the hat situation. So
beautiful. Well, I think Drake is a highest level listener, and I'm sure he won't. I'm sure he doesn't take it personally. He has plenty of money. He can go get other Eastern Conference Finals hats. So, but I'm glad you were able to use the fundamentals you teach the players to box him out and get that coveted championship hat.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I was almost ashamed of that story for a while. Now I'm like, no, I'm going to tell it. It's a good story.
Yes. Tell it with pride.
Yeah.
Brittni, this was fantastic. I really appreciate you responding to my random Twitter DM. And thank you so much for joining me today on The Highest Level.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to connecting again.